wait a lot longer. But I should say before we begin that I have a little cold here, a late winter cold. I didn't recognize that it was spring, so I'm not hugging people or even shaking hands with them out of sensitivity to their own well-being. All right, are we to go? Let's begin. Thank you for coming. I welcome you in the name of the Eisenhower Media Fellows and the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. It's very rare that we get together in this way and have a number of distinguished speakers from both organizations. And I think it would be fitting if we started first with a reflection, a moment of silence, and I've asked Pastor Rebecca Vargas, who's the pastor of a local Lutheran church, and with whom I studied at the hands of the ecumenical pastor Gordon Cosby, and we went our ways largely under his influence. So, Rebecca, could you give us a little start out here in the right way? Thank you.
Good morning. Before we speak of war this morning, I've been invited for just a moment to point our attention to peace. Last week I was in a conversation with a friend about the world, and as we were talking, my friend eventually kind of came to a conclusion of that's just the way the world is. And when he said that's just the way the world is, and just sort of with a dismissive tone, I felt myself pushing back. And I said to my friend, well, maybe the way the world is right now, but this is not the world I want to live in. He came back to me with, I'm not sure whether it was maybe a tone of sarcasm or for sure cynicism, maybe a little condescension. He made the point that this is the only inhabitable planet that we know of. So we're going to have to get along with the world as it is. I countered. I said, when I use the phrase, the world I want to live in, and that this is not the world I want to live in, I'm not making the point that I'm flipping through the Sears catalog, looking for a different world with better features. I'm making the point that I believe there is something else possible on this planet. Regardless of our faith tradition or our lack of faith tradition, our humanitarian position, we all can agree, I believe, that in the realm of God and spirit and love, there is a possibility for a different way. There's a different way to be the human family. There is a different set of assumptions about what is inevitable that is available to us. We do not have to accept violence or war as the final word or the only outcome. We don't have to assume that domination and destruction are all part of the world as a given. We're called to something greater. We're capable of love. We are capable and called to mercy for the most vulnerable among us. So this morning, as we set out to discuss war, I want to suggest that we not assume war is the only way possible. Before we turn our attention for several hours to the subject matter of war, I want to invite us for just a moment to be intentional about acknowledging another way. So, for just a moment, I invite you, I invite us envision, to reflect on, to pray for another kind of world on this earth. A world shaped by a different set of assumptions. A world where life is sacred, where the stranger is welcomed, where debts are forgiven, and there is enough for all. God grant that our prayers for peace might become in us lives of peace, which in turn might become among us a different kind of world. Amen.
Let the church say, Amen. Thank you so much, Pastor Rebecca. I had this great thought as I rose up here that Secretary Hexeth might invite you to lead the next morning prayers. Slightly different tone. Again, on behalf of the IPS and the Eisenhower Media Network, you're almost welcome. And it's nice to see so many here, particularly those from the press. I mean, not against just local people, from the press, the national press, and all that. We're starting a little late, so I'm going to keep my comments a little shorter than usual. But let me just say a word about, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. Some of you know that we set ourselves up in January of 2003 when we saw that our former colleagues were falsifying intelligence to justify a war of aggression. It doesn't get any worse than that, folks, in my profession. So we spoke out, we got together, and now we're growing since, have attracted people like former directors of the NSA, FBI people, all manner of other people who have helped us. And the Eisenhower Media Network, of course, is very much active more recently, and it has an incredible pack of real senior and junior officers who speak personally, who have been there and done that, and don't take it next in rhetoric or MPS. So, just to set that tone. A lot of my grown children and other people of that age, we're talking mid-50s, are really disturbed at what is happening here with respect to Iran. And their colleagues, when I quiz their colleagues, they say, well, what do you think's going on? What's going on? And they say, well, there's no plan, and now I've been drafted, people send Marines to think, my God, no plan. I said, well, what do you think we did this? I don't know. There's no plan. And I said, well, why? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And the answer has never been clearer. You not only have the Secretary of State / the National Security Advisor stating it explicitly, but you have a very prominent head of the National Counterterrorism Center saying the same thing. So we're going to explore a little about that, and I just would like to start out by setting a little background here. May we have the first slide, please? Now, I wouldn't bother you with this if it weren't for the fact that there's two teaching points here. One is that when the Iraq War was being prepared, we had all manner of people saying how evil the Muslims were, how they scientists don't like a lot of BS, right? And so they came to a conclusion, which you see illuminated there, why the Muslims don't feel freedom. They rather hate our policies. And I'll just read this key one. The overwhelming majority of Muslims object to what they see as a one-sided support of Israel against Palestinian rights and the long-standing, even increasing support for what Muslims collectively see as tyrannies. Thus, when American public diplomacy talks about bringing democracy to Islamist society, this is seen as no more than self-serving hypocrisy. This is a panel and Pentagon. This is a bunch of scientists who said, this is so much BS, let's speak out here. We know they don't hate our freedom, we know what they hate. And what they hate, as stated here, is our country's one-sided support of Israel against Palestinian rights. What do I mention all this? Well, this was part of the preparation for identifying Saddam Hussein with 9/11, making believe that there were ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, as well as the weapons of mass destruction business. Okay? So it was very key. Now, some of you probably didn't know about this science defense science board proclamation, even though it was issued on September 24th, 2004. Oh, before the election, 2004. Well, the reason you don't know about it is because nobody published it. 2 months later, the New York Times published it on the evening before Thanksgiving. And they omitted the important sentence that said, the overwhelming majority object to what they see as our one-sided support of Israel against Palestinian rights. That was excised. Tom Schenker for the New York Times finally reported on this, but he excised it. So the sentence before and the sentence after, what do you think, we wouldn't notice? Well, hardly anybody notices those things. But that's how bad it is in terms of mainstream media, except for the folks here, of course, who would never succumb to that kind of thing. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. I'm not making up the fact that the intelligence was manufactured. There was a 5-year study by the Senate Intelligence Committee with a report issued on June 5, 2008, and it said, quote, in making the case for war on Iraq, intelligence was repeatedly presented as fact when in reality it was unsubstantiated, contradicted, or even non-existent. So I ask you to reflect on what does non-existent intelligence look like? Well, most people don't remember, but there was a True report that day, the one that said what I just quoted from. And then there was another report. That report was reflecting what non-existent intelligence looked like. When this study, this True study was set up, the vice chair requested an investigation into the frauds. Remember that yellow cake stuff? That was yellow cake uranium from deepest surface Africa. A brainchild of Cheney, right? Okay. Well, those Niger documents generated this thing. Where the hell? Who cooked that up? We know who it was. It was Douglas Feith. And the Office of Special Plans. Well, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, for God's sake. And there was another report released that same day, which said, report on intelligence activities in Iraq conducted by the Office of Special Plans within the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. It was replete with clandestine meetings that were totally, mishandled from the beginning, from the beginning to the end. These clandestine activities were mishandled from the beginning to the end, and CIA and other intelligence agencies were kept in the dark about this. The information was not shared either by the National Security Advisor or by Paul Wolfowitz, who was doing all this stuff. Okay, so there was this twin thing. And what I want to do it now, I guess what I refer to Karen, that's Karen Kwiatowski. Have any of you seen A Shock and Awe by Robert Wagner? Okay, some have. It's a real treat. Long story short, Karen is one of us, one of those veteran intelligence professionals Saturday, and we went to the premiere. Oh, the Muckety Books were there. John Brennan was there. I think Clapper was there in disguise. But that's a big thing, you know, right? Okay. So what happens? They show the film. It's really interesting because this person in the Pentagon who had incredible contacts and watched Israeli generals go in and out without signing in, without even fairly well, watched Israeli high officials do the same thing to Douglas Feith's office, this Office of Special Plans within his office as Undersecretary of Defense. And who that was, that person? That was Karen Kwiatowski. Now, we never knew that she told Knight Ritter that story until we watched the film. And we still didn't know it was she until she came down from the balcony and said, okay, now I want my friends in VIPS and everybody else to know, I confess I did it. It was terrific. See the film. In any case, I asked Karen, who's out of town right now, to do a little video. It's only 10 minutes, and it sort of explains where she's coming from, why she made the video, and explains a little bit about how she sat in the catbird seat watching all this stuff happen, watching this intelligence speaking, adulterated intelligence shared with Dick Cheney and George Bush, but not with the intelligence community, even though the intelligence community knew that was going on. So maybe we have that video now, Peter.
Hello, this is Karen Kwiatowski, and I'm really sorry I couldn't join you in person today, but I wanted to, and I'm sending this my message, at least of support for what's happening, and to provide maybe a little perspective on what I saw back in 2002 and 2003. So if you don't know my story, and I'm sure most of you might, I spent 20 years in the Air Force, retired as a lieutenant colonel. And my last several years were working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense under Marcel. So I was in the Pentagon during 9/11, and I saw the reaction that the Pentagon took and the policies that the Pentagon chose and that George W. Bush chose, that Dick Cheney chose. And so I'm watching all this from a perspective of someone who spent the first 10 years of my career in the Cold War and the second 10 years of my career in the making of American war abroad, post-Cold War, in the new peace. I watched, I guess that you could say, what we thought was the peace dividend get basically used up and wasted by the military-industrial complex, which was determined to continue its business line, which is war, exporting war abroad, creating it, supporting it, building for it, relying on it, preparing pretexts for it. And then, of course, a pretext for war was certainly what happened in 2002. What I saw is what many of us came to know really a few short years after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and that was that bits and pieces of intelligence and bits and pieces of information was melded together into a very ideological, neoconservative storyline, and then fed directly into the mouths of the baby bird sitting in the White House. At that time, of course, was George W. Bush, and he certainly meets the criteria of a baby bird. We've had several baby birds since then. Of course, now we have Trump. He's a big baby bird. And he's being fed information, not from the military wise folks talking about how they would like to defend the United States, because our military doesn't really orient itself towards defense of the United States. But instead, he gets information about their offensive capabilities, exaggerated And he also hears from his intelligence community, which is, of course, very controlled and filled with people that say what the president wants to hear, and not just him, because this tendency of having your intelligence community say and produce exactly what, let's say, for example, Dick Cheney wants to hear, which we have evidence that he went repeatedly to the CIA and came back to say, this is what I want to hear, produce it for me. Okay, and that trend has continued, despite efforts to the contrary, despite the fact that the American people have woken up that this is how it works and they don't like it, it should change, it doesn't change. So what we have now is Trump hearing from really what I would consider a diseased Pentagon leadership cadre, okay, diseased and demented in many ways. He hears from an intelligence community that instead of recovering from its abuse and illegalities and constraints put upon it that prevent it from being objective, instead of recovering from that in the early 2000s, they have simply built it into their system. And I think if anyone watched the Tulsi Gabbard presentation along with Ratcliffe, CIA Director Ratcliffe sitting beside her, if anybody watched that earlier this week, or I guess it would be last week when you're seeing this, they would understand exactly what has happened. These are co-opted people who couldn't tell the truth, couldn't recognize intelligence, and have no spine to present the facts to the president and the lie about having the facts. So that's what we've got. And then the other factor that comes in, particularly with Donald Trump, we see, is that he has a great deal of loyalty and a sense of being beholden to his donors. Now, who are his donors? Well, his donors are the same people that ran the scam in 2002. They're the same people that advised think tanks and universities and the White House and Congress that the way forward for Israel in a clean break policy back in 1999, the way forward for an expanded state of Israel was, let's get the United States to send their boys and send their gold and send their blood and wealth and time and defensive capability that should be used at home. Let's let them pay and fight and die and get ground up. Let's let them waste American taxpayer money so that we, in Israel, the Israeli government, and many Israelis, can expand with less risk than it would be if we actually did it by ourselves. We can't do it by ourselves. So let's get the U.S. to do it. So these are the guys that advised and funded President Trump's election. Not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. So this is a long development of influence over the Trump White House. It doesn't matter what he said about bringing the troops home and no wars overseas and making America great again. It doesn't matter what he said. What matters is where the money flows. And we know where the money flows. We know how it flows. This hasn't changed. What has changed, and I'll leave you really with this kind of thinking, that Americans have woken up quite a bit. We have access to a lot of information, not through the media, not through mainstream media, certainly never through newspapers, but we have access to information that gives Americans a more sophisticated view of American foreign policy. We don't really understand it, okay, but it's quite simple. It's based on war, and it's based on money, and it's right now, and for many years now, it's been based on what Israel wants, because as Israel looks after its own national interests, one of the main things that it discovered, and of course, I witnessed this myself in the Pentagon in 2002, but what we discovered was Israeli interests can be melded with American interests if you work it through the executive branch and all of the various executive branch systems, particularly the most expensive one of those, which is the Pentagon, and the second most expensive, which I suspect is probably the CIA. So you integrate, you meld your interests with those agencies, and then you get to where Congress knows better than to vote against an Israeli initiative. So when they want something done, they can put their finger on every single congressman except Thomas Massey and get what they want. So that's been done. And then they propagandize the American people with kind of okay? Like, the terrorists are gonna get us. They're out to get us. And lies about whoever the enemy of the day is. And we've seen this happen really for a lot longer than I've been really paying attention to it, but we've certainly seen it happening for the past 30 years. We have enemies, they hate us. It's a mystery why they hate us, no one really knows. They're just evil people, we have to get rid of them. That's in the Constitution, I guess. So, this is what we are fed as the American people. But luckily, like I said, I think many of us are learning. We're becoming a little more sophisticated in our understanding of how government creates narratives, how they shape their narratives. Trump is helping with this, of course, because if you follow him on Truth Social or wherever else he posts, he is providing us a roadmap of how the government lies. They lie with abandon, sometimes very creatively. We're expected to believe it or else we're fools. And this is interesting, because I think we're not fools. I don't think Americans are. I think we've learned a little bit, and I have to believe that, because the sacrifice of people who have stood up, like the VIPS organization, and really everybody. There's so many individuals who have stepped forward and said, this isn't right, here's what is right. And they face great risk, and of course, we see it with Joe Kent right now. What did he do? He resigned, and he said very much what I think 95% of the American population, if they are being objective, understand to be true. He's not lying, he's telling the truth. It's the same truth that many of us spoke about in 2000. It's the truth that people talked about in the mid-2000s when we were torturing people at Abu Ghraib and in Cuba and Guantanamo. It's the same truth. More and more of us are saying it, and more independent media is understanding that we do have a war problem. It's not just an overseas war problem of wars of choice for Israel or wars of choice to fund our military industrial complex. Our war problem is that our government, in many cases, and certainly what we're seeing now, is making war against Americans. We, by questioning a government narrative, become the enemy. And I think if you watch, it didn't take very long before Joe Kent has an FBI investigation launched. Why? Well, it's very interesting. They don't want to hear what Joe has to say, and they don't want to hear what we have to say, and they don't want to hear what Americans have to say. And so, we have an opportunity here, with what Trump has done, what our Congress has allowed him to do, what Israel has done. It is so blatant, and it is so obvious, and it is so criminal, that I think we have an opportunity really to gather ourselves mentally, physically, and spiritually, and really consider that we in America are in fact not just made weaker by this, but we are made far more vulnerable, not just as a nation, but even as people. To speak out today is just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than it was 20 years ago. So I'll leave you with it. We need to keep our eyes open and keep our brains functional, and we need to stand up against this. This has got to stop. It's very wrong. I think we all know that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Garrett. So there you have it, chapter and verse as to how it worked, and how Karen, to her very great credit, wouldn't stand by and just watch it. Even while she was still on active duty, she talked with Warren Strobel and Jonathan Landay of the Night Bird group of people. They were doing this to get it right, and that's well depicted in this film called Shock and Awe by Rob Reiner. The only difference really is that the actress portraying Karen is not as beautiful as Karen. She tries her best. Now, let me just make another comment or two. Karen talked about not only the Pentagon, but the Senate and House of Representatives being largely pro-Israel. This is no news to any of us. I remember only have 2 senators. Then they'd only have 2 senators. Except for Senator Sheehy, who manfully piled on, and Brian, by the way, Brian McGinnis will be with us a little bit later. You know, he was the person who with Josie was at that hearing and had his arm broken, his left arm broken, by the manful efforts of Senator Sheehy, I think from Montana. So, yeah, we would only have 2 plus Sheehy and plus the majority of the others. What else did we say here? Just this, that when Joe Kent was mentioned, I think probably it bears repeating what he alluded to very briefly earlier on. When people ask why that saying, well, back in 2003, it wasn't so simple. There was oil, there were attempts to covet military bases in northern Iraq, and there was Israel. And in those days, I thought it was sort of like 33. Equally, those were the motivations. But since then, I've learned there was more than 50% Israel. Now it's clear. Why is it clear? Well, it bears reading what our Secretary of State said, because there's only 2 sentences. Here it is. Secretary Mark Rubio, quote, "We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action against Iran. We knew that that would precipitate an attack on American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties," end quote, Rubio told reporters. Think about that, folks. And of course, Joe Kent, he said there was no immediate threat. No immediate threat, okay. And he also said there was Israel and Israeli supporters on both sides of the ocean that were responsible for the attack in Iran. So when I meet my friends of younger age, I said, well, you know, really ought to ask why, and maybe you find out why if you tune into our little symposium today. And that's what we hope to show. Not only that these don't need to be mysteries, but sometimes they're so damn clear that they escape attention. Finally, Pastor Rebecca, we're really glad that you said it took the tone that is set at the Pentagon for such meetings. Let's remember that we're as much heart as mind. And let's remember little girls. We have 3 of them. We had 3 of them. We have 6 granddaughters. We have 2 sons as well. I care about little girls. And just to move on here, I want to show what happens when the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense conjures up or made up stuff, okay? Not, what was it? Contradicted, unsubstantiated, or non-existent, okay? Non-existent stuff which I tried to remind you, in a companion Senate Intelligence Committee report issued the same day, 5 June 2008, said these clandestine contacts with 100 of these evidences, they were inappropriate and they were mishandled from beginning to end. And the intelligence community and others were not appropriately informed. Well, that's a nice way of saying it. It's not actually secret. So we launched a war on the basis of evidence conjured up by Doug Feith, in whose office Karen worked. So, with respect to heart as well as mind, I'd like to go to the intelligence dreamed up largely by sources tied to Israel, and that is demonstrable, and that is a shame because we have the same thing going on. Now, let's pass by little Samara Hussein at 5, and let's look at some little Iranian. Say again?
Can you speak closer to the mic?
It's closer to the mic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, we can't hear you all.
Okay. Can you all hear me now?
Just a little louder.
A little louder? Okay. Maybe it's not cold. Thank you, Josie. Okay, what I'd like to show you now are a picture of some Iranian young girls in more peaceful times. Maybe we have the next slide, please, Peter. Now, that fellow there is a friend of mine. He's from New Zealand, but he's an old Irishman. And he was visiting, his name is Eugene Gallagher. He was visiting Isfahan in 2018. And he had that little thing snapped. And he included it in an article that had to do with what happens to little Iranian girls now. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, there are 2 1/4 Iranian girls. The girls of Minap, after the tomahawk strike, the double tap that killed about 165 of them. This will not appear in any of our media. It was sent to me from a fellow I know, Swiss. So with taping that in and seeing what's next. Next slide, please. Okay, there are the 165 little girls of Iraq between the ages of 6 and 12 prepared for burial. So, just would ask you to see how your heart feels, hopefully the same as mine. When we realize intellectually that this was all done unnecessarily for the interests of another country, and that top intelligence officials say that, but also no less than the Secretary of State has said that explicitly. What do we do about these things, and how do they impact on what happens next? I guess the effects of these things, I guess you could take that slide down now. I guess the effects of these things are not limited to little girls. And to get on time here, I'd like to introduce a friend of mine who's sitting here at the dais, and whose name is Old Sarge, a.k.a. Bryce Lockwood, Sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Now, I'd like to introduce this by saying how I met Old Sarge. During the years immediately after Iraq, I was invited lots of places to talk because people were listening. How do we get into this mess? And I could tell them pretty much what I knew. I didn't, as I said before, I didn't think that Israel was more responsible, more than 50% responsible. I thought oil had something to do with it, and those permanent nodes. No, we don't say permanent. They were, remember the word? They were enduring military bases. Enduring sounds a little bit more endearing, doesn't it? You follow those in anyhow, I thought it was like 1/3 each, but I'm convinced now it was mostly Israeli. And Karen and her input has convinced me of that. Now, so here I am in Springfield, Missouri, on a little tour arranged by a young woman I didn't even know, hitting several cities, and I saw the Mississippi River right there, right in front of me. It was the first time ever I wasn't flying over it. It was a terrific tour, and I ended up in a place called Springfield, Missouri, a sizable town, okay? And I was asked to speak to this congregation of maybe 300 to 400 people packed in this very large church hall. So I was speaking about Iraq, and during the Q&A session, somebody raised their hand and said, "Now, Mr. Governor, have you read John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's piece on Israel lobby?" And I said, "Thank you, Jesus. I had just read it on the plane going down there, okay? They just put it out, actually. Interesting story. They were commissioned by the Atlantic Monthly to write a piece on the Israel lobby. And so they gave the draft to the Atlantic Monthly, and those guys said, "Oh, yeah, please. we'll pay you something, but we won't keep it right that, you know." They looked all over the United States of America, could find no one to publish this. And Stephen Walt, big professor at Yale, I think, Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. They had to go to the London Review of Books. Okay, illustrative thing here. And they finally published this paper. And that was in early 2006. And so here I'm out in September 2006, out in Springfield, Missouri. And somebody says, "Mr. McGovern, have you read that?" I said, "Yes, I read it on the plane. What did you think of it?" I said, "Well, I thought it was a very gutsy thing. But I have to tell you that, the intent was to show the power of the Israel lobby, but they missed the most convincing proof." And I looked down at this sea of 300, 400 faces, and I said, "What I mean is the USS Liberty incident, June 8th, 1967. And I saw blank faces. And then they said, "Who knows about USS Liberty incident?" 3 hands go up, one in the back, one in the middle, one in the front. So I picked up the fellow in the front. I said, "Sir, could you get up and how do you know about the USS Liberty?" Ramrod straight, he stood. Gunnery Sergeant Bryce Lockwood, head of Marine Detachment on USS Liberty, sir. Now, I know enough about it to know that he had lost his entire detachment. He, by some stroke of luck, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, little Sarge, he was told to get rid of that sensitive equipment, get it off into the bottom of the Mediterranean where hopefully nobody will find it. So he was behind a bulwark when the Israeli torpedo hit his section, his marine section of the USS Liberty. I'm not going to go into any more detail because I hope that Old Sarge will. Suffice it to say that I was not shocked, but I was really surprised nobody knew about it. And then when Bryce was asked if he could come up, Old Sarge said, and correct me if I remember, we haven't really talked about this. "Sir, I have not talked about this, but it's 40 years ago now. I would like to try tonight." And Old Sarge came up, and I won't steal his thunder. Old Sarge's shooter right to my right. First time I've seen him since the 50th anniversary. Oh, well, we have that next slide, Peter. I think we have a little picture of, oh, there we are. There's old sergeant uniform. That was the 50th anniversary of the June 8th, 1967 event. There are 3 survivors and me. Just to show you what the USS Liberty looked like after the attack, here we have the next and last slide. "34 U.S. sailors and Marines killed, 173, 170 plus people deadly injured. And worst of all, as old Sarge will tell you, not only the U.S. Navy covered it up under instructions from the Pentagon, but the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, covered it up as well. So there's been no justice done to these survivors, and like me, these survivors are getting older in age, but today I'm delighted to introduce to you Old Sarge Bryce Lockwood, head of the Marine Detachment on the USS Liberty.
Little background, early 1960s, several sub-Saharan African countries had recently won their independence. Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Great Britain. Yet there was a heavy influence by both the Soviet Union and Cubans in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily due to the wealth of natural materials, gold, silver, rare metals. And the United States wanted to keep track of what was going on. Mind you, back in the early 1960s, satellites were very rudimentary. In order to keep track of things, you had to get up pretty close. Several vessels were taken out of mothballs, fitted with high intelligence materials, electronics. USS Liberty was one of those. She was commissioned in 1945 as the USS Simmons Victory, a cargo-carrying ship. She was, in 1965, the U.S. government spent $26 million equipping the USS Liberty with the latest electronics intelligence. Also aboard her, we had the world's largest mobile computer, a UNIVAC 500. You could probably do about as much intelligence with your smartphone today, but in 1965, the UNIVAC 500 was pretty top dollar. USS Liberty was sent with linguists up and down the west coast of Africa, monitoring what was going on with these newly found independent countries. In 1967, war appeared to be imminent between Israel and her neighbors. The USS Liberty was ordered to proceed to Port of Rota, Spain, take on fuel and stores, pick up 6 additional linguists, and proceed with all due haste to the eastern Mediterranean. Cruise in international waters up and down the coast of Gaza. I was one of those linguists that was taken aboard USS Liberty on June 1st of 1967. On June the 5th, hostilities broke out between Israel and her neighbors. I remember seeing the intelligence report from the U.S. Army that Israel had actually initiated hostilities. That was not what the press was told. The press was told that the Egyptians had initiated hostilities. Let me back up a little bit further here too. There was a group of U.S. Phantom photo reconnaissance aircraft that was sent to the United States to Toronto Air Base in Spain. When they arrived, all the U.S. markings were obliterated on the aircraft. The pilots were given neutral uniforms and neutral identification and sent to overfly the United Arab Republic. At that time consisted of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and to a lesser extent Libya. The results of those flights were given to the Israelis. When hostilities broke out, they knew where every aircraft was located, every piece of artillery, every tank. The Egyptians were in defensive positions. They had dug in the rear of their tanks to where they could get more trajectory on their projectiles. On June the 8th, we had the drill general quarters at noontime. We secured from drill GQ. I had the mid-watch the night before. I was at my rack stamping my name in some new t-shirts, when suddenly there was a very loud noise. I'd never been under enemy fire before, but I knew immediately that we were in serious trouble. I dropped what I was doing and headed for my GQ station, which was below decks. There was a crew of 294 aboard the USS Liberty. Out of that 294, roughly 180 were intelligence collection people. Linguists, Morse code operators, voice intercept operators, technical intercept people. I went to my GQ station down below decks. I remember the division senior enlisted man, Chief Smith, saying, well, I guess we're going to have to initiate destruction. When you've spent years collecting intelligence, you don't want to hear that. All those years of work, breaking codes, translating languages, putting it all together to make some readable intelligence out of it. That all had to go into ditching bags. We had these large canvas bags with a lead weight at the bottom and brass barrels at the side. When we collected voice intercept tapes in those days, we didn't have chips to do the work. We used 6-inch magnetic reels. There were hundreds of those. Linguistics magazines, manuals. And all that had to go into ditching bags and over the top. The captain came on the speaker system, the internal speaker system of the ship, and said, brace yourselves, torpedo attack, starboard side. I remember one of my friends saying, well, they hit us with everything else, what else can they hit us with? There were 826 large caliber strikes on the ship, 40mm cannon fire, guided missiles, heat-seeking missiles. Every transmission antenna that we had was destroyed. The Israelis were jamming our distress frequencies, which is a violation of international law. They were using unmarked aircraft, which is a violation of international law. The division officer stuck his head in the door and said, Sergeant Locke, would you come here a minute, please? I stepped out into the passageway and he got me into a discussion with the senior research officer aboard the ship, Commander David Lewis. It was a range job to get shot at, and there's these heavy bags full of intelligence material that's got to be taken topside and pitched over into the sea. The idea being by the time they could be recovered, there wouldn't be anything there of value. We had just gotten into this conversation when suddenly there was a very loud noise and a flash of fire. I knocked to the deck. First thought that came to my mind said, well, Lord, I guess this is it. I guess I'm going home. At least Lois and the kids are taken care of. Lois is my wife. I felt something cold I looked down and water was gushing in. And I heard a moan behind me. And there was a sailor. His name was Joe Lentini. Joe had stepped out into the center passageway and had taken a piece of shrapnel from an Israeli rocket in his thigh. He got the tourniquet and sat down on the deck and leaned up against the ladderway, which is the only way out. I was putting a tourniquet on that wound when the torpedo struck. We had sheet steel bulkheads that separated the various compartments on the ship. You were required to only be in the area that you had access to. That was so if someone should compromise the intelligence, only that small piece would be compromised. Those sheet steel bulkheads just mushroomed with the force of the explosion. Joe's leg was caught in that and literally made toothpicks out of it. He was moaning. I tried to get my arms under his and pull him loose, but he was wedged in there tightly. I said, "Come on, you got to get your legs under and help me. I can't do it by myself. Come on, push." And he realized that his left leg was smashed. But he was able to get his right leg under him and move just enough pressure to where I could pull him loose. By that time, the water was almost to the overhead. We only had about 1.5 foot of airspace. Mind you, 180 intelligence people crammed into this underwater compartment. The only way out was a ladderway, which is about 2 feet wide, very steep. There was a lot of screaming and hollering going on, and as loud as I could, I said, "Knock it off! If y'all don't settle down, none of us will get out of here alive." And I heard the division officer, Lieutenant Bennett, at the top of the ladderway saying, "This is Mr. Bennett, open this hatch." Apparently I passed out because the next thing I remember was I was holding a man's head above water. There was no lights. The only light we had was coming through the torpedo hole, which is roughly 36 by 42 feet, most of it below the water line. He was unconscious. I was trying to hold his head above water. I struggled to go up the ladderway. When the torpedo struck, it ruptured a boat fuel tank. Bunker oil is what fired the boilers and made the steam to drive the ship. That bunker oil stunk to high heavens. Heavy waste oil, so close to it was. And that was everywhere. Oil and water doesn't mix very well. You put it on steel and it's pretty slippery. I got this guy started at the ladderway, and the piece of the torpedo had struck the railing on that ladderway and bent it into where there was only about 1.5 foot of space. I got to that place and I dropped him. As the ship was rolling with the sea, the water was gushing in and out. He set it back out towards the torpedo hole, went back, got him, started back up the ladder again. Got to watch out for that bent railing. Got him to the top, and the hatch was sealed shut. I was trying to hold his head above water and pounding on the hatch, and a sailor named Bobby Schnell came and opened the hatch to let me out. There was another sailor there named Phil Turney. Phil was part of the damage control aboard the ship. Phil said the captain has announced, prepare to abandon ship, said you need to get a life vest on, put a life vest on him, this unconscious sailor, and take him to the mess decks. All the tables that we ate off from, they'd taken mattresses and put it on there, and were trying to take care of the most severely wounded. I tried to pick him up, dropped him, tried to pick him up again, dropped him again. Phil said, "Oh, here's Bobby Schnell." Bobby was a weightlifter in pretty good physical shape. He picked him up and trotted back to the mess decks with him. I felt real thirsty, and there was a smell of that drinking fountain around the corner in another passageway. I went over to get a drink of water, and a black man stared back at me. Apparently, when the torpedo struck, The only thing that happened to me was blast effect from the torpedo. It killed 25 men all around me. How I escaped, I don't know. We were told to go to the radio room, which is on the starboard side of the ship. The Israelis were using 3 motor torpedo boats. They had fired 5 torpedoes at us. Years later, at one of our reunions, one of the fellows that was in the front part of the ship had heard a strange noise. Didn't realize what it was. That was a near-miss torpedo. I remember lying on the deck in a radio room and hearing this mayday go out. Firefox, this is Rockstar. Under attack by unidentified surface and air units, require immediate assistance. It seemed that when the Israelis were firing rockets at us, they couldn't jam our distress frequencies because that would screw up the flight of the rockets. In that brief moment of time, that mayday went out, and immediately the shooting stopped. These mortar torpedo boats were circling us and firing heavy caliber machine guns onto us. There were 3,100 strikes from those heavy caliber machine guns. I kept wondering why. They told us, oh, there's no need for an escort. We can have air cover to you in 10 minutes. We had been under attack for well over an hour at that period of time. Mind you, you Israelis were using unmarked aircraft, violating international law. One of those pilots refused to fire on us. He said, "It's an American ship. It's an American ship. I can see the flag." His name was Lev Toth. He returned to base, was court-martialed, spent 5 years in Israeli prison. When he was released, he came to the United States, started hanging around with a lady who was a bank bilker. Bankers don't like messing with their money. Levi Toth got sentenced to another 5 years in prison. In 1988, his girlfriend contacted a U.S. congressman by the name of Kwiatowski, Republican congressman from the state of California, and asked him if he wouldn't go to Springfield, Missouri and interview this pilot at a federal medical prison located in Springfield. Congressman Kwiatowski sent me a dossier from that Israeli pilot, 3/4 of an inch thick. Among the documents in that dossier was an interview that Congressman Kwiatowski had with a former Israeli Mossad agent in Canada. If you wouldn't come to the United States, he said, my life wouldn't be worth a nickel in the United States. One of those documents was an Israeli Mossad attempt to assassinate George Herbert Walker Bush because he was not friendly enough towards Israel. I was medevac to the carrier America. While I was aboard the America, Commander Dave Lewis, whom I was talking to in a torpedo struck, I was facing a torpedo and my glasses protected me from the debris from the torpedo. Commander Lewis was perpendicular to us, and that debris went under his glasses and sealed his eyes shut. It was about 5 days after the attack. He was in the optical section aboard the America, and his eyes had just been lanced open. Admiral Larry Geis, who was commander of Task Force 6, that included the carriers USS Saratoga, USS America, and the guided missile cruiser USS Little Rock, asked Commander Lewis to come to his stateroom. He swore Mr. Lewis to secrecy until, quote, after I am dead, and related this story. Rescue aircraft had been dispatched from the USS Saratoga to come to our aid. They had nuclear weapons aboard them. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came on the air and said, get those aircraft back. Joe Tully, who was the skipper aboard the USS Saratoga, figured out that that's probably why they were recalled, is because of those nuclear weapons. He relaunched aircraft with conventional weaponry, again announced that he had launched them, and again Secretary McNamara came on the air and said, get those aircraft back. Admiral Dice said he wanted to exercise his authority, to hear that from higher authority, where the only higher authority was the President of the United States. President Johnson came on the air and said this, get those aircraft back. I will not have my allies embarrassed. They were using unmarked aircraft, and we did not know who was attacking us. How did President Johnson know? America's entire nuclear force was on full alert the morning of June 8, 1967, before we were attacked. Why? President Johnson hated President Gamal Nasser, president of Egypt. Hated him. We think the president set us up, sacrificial lamb, sink the ship, kill everyone aboard it, and get the U.S. involved on the side of Israel. In 2005, Steve Rosen, then a senior officer with his IPAC, was dining with Jeffrey Goldberg, who was then with the New Yorker magazine. I believe he's currently with the Atlantic. He said, you see this napkin? In 24 hours, I can have the signatures of 70 United States senators on this napkin. 70 U.S. senators. We did nothing. Survivors were ordered to silence. You say anything about this, we'll send you to Fort Leavenworth and forget about you. There has never been a U.S. Congress investigation into the attack on the USS Liberty, which is required under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution to investigate acts of piracy on the high seas and violations of the law of nations. There has never been a U.S. congressional investigation of the attack on the Liberty. Years later, the USS Davis was attacked off the coast of Yemen. 17 sailors were killed. U.S. Congress spent 9 months investigating that attack. But it was America's best ally that attacked the USS Liberty. We did nothing. The result? Israel realized they could do whatever they wanted. And U.S. Congress, U.S. government, would do nothing. Please don't mistake anything I have to say today as being anti-Jewish. My argument is not against Jewish people. It's against a foreign government who attacked a vessel of the United States on the high seas in international waters and covered it up. 70,000 Gazans killed. And the U.S. supplied bombs. 1 million Palestinians, refugees, homeless. Israel attacking Lebanon now. Beirut, pretty much destroyed. 1 million Lebanese, homeless, and we did nothing.
Guys, well, Sergeant, would you like to say something about Admiral Moore's investigation?
The only investigation attack on the Liberty was ordered by the government. It took 5 days. And Admiral Thomas Moore, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, personally concluded that we were ordered to accept the Israeli excuse that it was a case of mistaken identity. The so-called shit that the Israelis claimed we were mistaken for was the Egyptian World War I horse transport, the El Qasir, which was in dry docks in Alexandria, Egypt, had not been to sea for 20 years and was waiting to be cut up for scrap. The only armament was a 4-inch muzzle-loading cannon. Quite a case of mistaken identity. And I guess you could say the Israeli pilots were colorblind because Egyptian ships are painted black with hall markings in Arabic script. U.S. ships are painted gray. Maybe they were colorblind. Questions?
Yeah, if we can have questions now. Actually, I have a couple things to add here. Admiral Moore, as you may recall, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retired when he took this up. He felt strongly about this, clearly, and came to the right conclusions. He was also our ambassador to London. No little fellow was Admiral Moore. I'm going to also just add one or two things about the Israeli. Sit down and I'll give you this stick. We will handle questions this way. Sit down. Yeah, I just want to, a lot of this is simple, and some of it you know, but God, you got to get it out here. So, what happened? 67, right? So here comes Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel in 1982, speaking, if memory serves, before the Nation Institute here in Washington. And I quote him. It's in the New York Times, if you look on page 85. Quote, Menachem Begin. In June 1967, we had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai and the Sinai approaches do not prove that Egyptian President Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. And all those students at the National Defense College, you all, oh, isn't that interesting? My God, we decided to attack him. Chutzpah? I mean, on steroids. Now, there are a couple other things here. Old Sarge has already told you about LBJ's hatred for Nasser, and now our own reconnaissance was devoted to making sure that the Israelis knew exactly where the Egyptian troops, such as they were deployed. I had a chance to ask the former chief of the Arab-Israeli branch of the Office of Counterintelligence at CIA. What do you remember about that? And he said, quote, there were intercepted messages, and they said very flatly and firmly that the pilots reported seeing American flags and repeated their requests for confirmation of the attack order. I remember one message, it said, but these are American ships, replied, follow your orders. So whole platoons of Americans saw those intercepts, says this branch chief. NSA now says they don't exist, then someone has ordered them destroyed. The other thing I just did, I don't think that also I mentioned there, you were in international waters the entire time.
13 and a half nautical miles
Yeah.
from the coast.
Okay.
Incidentally, Israel had plans to attack the Golan Heights on June the 8th when the Liberty showed up getting in the way. The Israelis had captured an entire Egyptian brigade in excess of 850 people, 850 men. They were pretty much hungry and had surrendered to the Israelis. Israel needed those troops that were guarding those Egyptian prisoners of war in order to take the Golan Heights. Many of those men were ordered to dig their own graves and were executed by the Israelis. It's a pretty serious violation of international law. Many of them had their hands tied behind their backs with barbed wire. I was giving a lecture in Kansas City some years ago and mentioning the attack on the Golan Heights, that the Israelis had bribed the Syrian officer in charge of defense of the Golan Heights to pull his troops back. This young gentleman named Fadi Banyamarja shot up his hand and said, "What you say is true. My uncle was that commander of the Syrian troops." They were ordered to pull our troops back and pretty much let Israel take the Golan Heights.
Yeah, so my last comment, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. We put that in because I hope that you all have a lot of curiosity here. For those who don't remember, the Israelis occupied a lot of territories in 1967. They withdrew from the Sinai, but not from the Golan Heights, not from Gaza, not from the West Bank. So, what did the international community think about that? Well, in those days, the UN had some pizzazz to it. Okay? There was a Security Council resolution in November of 1967, unanimously passed. Everyone agreed that Israel must leave occupied territories. Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, it's still there, folks, okay? And what's been done about it? Nothing. So the international community is also lax in enforcing international law. There it is right on the books. The U.S. and everyone else agreeing that this should be done. So just the last step here, when you talk about Hezbollah or Hamas, okay, terrorists. Well, I see some of you out there are international lawyers. You know that they're resistance forces. You know that international law permits resistance forces to try to resist occupiers, to include using violence, okay? And I was reminded that recently by a Chinese lawyer who's China's represented in Geneva at one of those UN bodies. The chapter in verse, he said, look, you label these guys terrorists. The resistance forces against the occupiers who have occupied these territories since 1967.
The way he talks.
I'm sorry, I feel a bit strongly about this, but let's now have questions and answers, and we have almost a half hour to do that. So, yes, first person there.
Yeah, you can hear me okay? I don't need a microphone.
No, speak up though.
Okay. My name is Jose Vega. I'm an independent candidate running for Congress in New York City at the Bronx. We've been, over the course of the last few weeks, assembling other independent candidates and activists on these weekly meetings to make Iranian sailors who are unarmed. 84 of their bodies are now being repatriated back to Iran, and some of them are still stuck in limbo, where they cannot go back yet. I think about that in the context of your story and the fact that this is happening again. It's the same policy. And many independent candidates right now are standing up and saying they want to reject that policy. We have been in New York under the subject of harassment, stalking, and other people trying to get access to my apartment. But I want to pose a question to both of you. What is it that the independent candidates, some of them like Tony Aguilar and myself and others are either watching online or in this room, would like to know? How can we get your story out there much more broadly? I thought that if people knew that that happened, they would look at what's going on in Iran in a much different way.
Thank you, Jose. There's one more independent candidate that's in this room. Would you like to identify yourself?
Brian McGinnis?
Oh!
And McGinnis. Okay. And I think there's one more.
Tony.
Tony. Yeah, well, Tony was mentioned. One more?
I'm running as a Democrat for the state legislature for Missouri, District 137. I'd like to add a little touch of humor here. Lloyd Painter, one of the officers aboard the ship, didn't get along real well with the skipper, got out of the Navy and put an application in with the Secret Service. He's in New York City with a fully automatic weapon in an elevator car. And Moshe Dayan, the one-eyed monster, got on that same elevator car, and Lloyd said, I thought about it. The last sailor that I took out of the ship, his name was David McFagan. And years later, Sunday morning, early Sunday morning, we're sitting in his kitchen with his family, and I want to know about what had happened to their dad. And Dave kind of bleated out and said, I wouldn't be hurt nearly as bad if you were to drop me so many times.
Next question, please. Yes, please.
Ray, you called out candidates for office, Ted McIntyre, Major, United States Air Force retired, running for governor,
Governor of?
North Carolina.
Whoa! I can vote for you because I'm a citizen of North Carolina. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Is there any current effort to try to reach out to mainstream media to reacquaint them with the story? Have you been making efforts on that? What kind of response do you get these days?
Okay, if everyone heard that, any efforts to get the story out, this is it, folks. This is it, as far as I know. And we'll try our best to get the story out, but as you see, it's uphill struggle. Right now, what we can do is to tell the obvious truth about why the attack on Iran. And as I say, it's never been clearer. Why is it that most people don't know why? And it's because it's been really subdued in the press. Not only what Secretary of State says, but also what Joe Kent says. Do you want to say anything more about that, or anything else?
I think I'm pretty well talked out.
Okay. Yes, Sam.
Thank you.
This is Sam Hosseini.
Could you clarify, you indicated in your remarks that you thought that Johnson was angling to actually get the U.S. directly involved in the attack. I'm not sure that I've heard that before. If you could clarify what you think the motives were. Wasn't the U.S. assessment that they thought that Israel would win if a conflict at that time between Egypt?
Joan Mellon, professor of English English at Temple University in Philadelphia, wrote a book, Faustian Bargains, documents President Johnson's rise to power. The 13th box of ballots disappeared during his run for congressman years ago, and documents the attack on the USS Liberty. Part of her story was the number 2 man in the US CIA at the time, James Eagleton. James Eagleton was a double agent with the Israeli Mossad.
Angleton.
Angleton, yes. Set up the attack on the Liberty to get us involved. There's another book too by Peter Hoonan, Operation Cyanide, a reporter who was digging through some presidential documents at the Lyndon Johnson Library, came across a staff briefing which included the president, and in the margin he had penciled in Operation Cyanide. That's where he got that title. He documents that America's entire nuclear force was on full of words. B-52 bombers, fully fueled, engines idling, nuclear weapons aboard, Beale Air Force Base in Marysville, California, sitting at the end of the runway, just waiting for orders to go do it. Yes, ma'am.
This is sort of a caveat from his question. We've seen the stories of USS Liberty coming out in the media more recently, and Phil Turney doing multiple interviews. What has the response from Congress and Senate been in order to actually do some sort of hearing or briefing?
Zero.
Not one, none.
I'm originally from upstate New York, a little town of Afton, New York. My dad's sister, mind you, this was 30 years ago, sat in a local restaurant and collected over 300 signatures on a petition to the congressman from her district. He said he would look into it, never did.
Yes, Brian.
Sarge, I want to thank you for being such a great role model and your bravery back in 1967, and also to body the pain and suffering you had to carry to this day. And thank you for being brave and sharing this story. I want to ask you 2 questions. What is your personal opinion of the trajectory of the awareness you've brought through your storytelling? And also, as you live in Missouri, I used to live across the Mississippi River in Illinois. What is the attitude of your fellow Missourians in regards to international affairs or Israeli meddling in international affairs?
I've lectured at College of Arts and Sciences at University of Missouri Columbia in March last year. It was on a weekend, so there wasn't a lot of attendees, but about 70 that were there. Standing ovation. Veterans Day last year, I was invited to speak to Lee Summit High School, Lee Summit, Missouri. Pretty much the same thing.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I was hoping both of you, either of you could address this, but we've obviously all seen the questioning of this unconditional alliance with Israel on the conservative side. A lot of outspoken folks now that have talked about why we're siding with a foreign power unconditionally. But I also wonder if you could address the counter argument to that that's also come from the left and progressives, which is to say that in fact, Israel is an extension of U.S. foreign policy in the region. What is your assessment of that, and how do you respond?
I think probably Steve Rosen I can have 70 U.S. senators' signatures on this napkin in 24 hours.
Are you on the white job?
I would just, if I could add, if you look at Iran, and if you look at, if I could ask you to look at Gaza, I've never thought that I would live in a country that would not only arm, support, enable genocide, but that's where we are. And why this president and his residue think that's justified, or why they think they should do that. Well, there's all the usual answers to that, but I suspect that there's also the Epstein factor here. I think that it's very clear this was a Mossad operation. That's not conspiracy, that's fact. We have Mossad operatives in the for that. We have one of them appealing to our president, please, just out with it, just confess, and we'll stop this carnage in Gaza and so forth. So I don't know what proportion of the motivation that our president supports genocide, forced starvation, and now has himself mousetrapped. Remember, the Secretary of State and the National Security Assistant, same guy, Rubio, said, I read it to you before, realized too that the National Security Assistant is the funnel through which all information flows to the president. That's why you had Brzezinski, that's why you had Kissinger, and that's why you had people setting themselves up in that crucial part of the National Security Council as the National Security Advisor, exact titles assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, does not have to be confirmed by the Senate. They control the flow of information. So if Rubio is the kind of guy I think he is, then he's in control of what Trump gets. And, not much better with Pete Hegseth or some of the others. Yeah, one question, I think, another one?
No, Ray, I just want to make a comment. I just want to make sure I understood
Yeah.
the question. Was it that, well, I didn't want to focus.
Was the question foreign policy an extension of Israel our foreign policy was an extension of it?
Yeah, only because the argument is very pervasive now, but Israel does its own thing, we shouldn't be involved. I'll react to it.
Somewhat, but I'll just remind you of one thing. Remember what Joe Biden said. If it was not an Israel, we would have created one.
Say who you are.
Okay, my name is Dennis Fritz, and I'm a retired Commander Chief Master Sergeant, and I think you're here for me at about 12:30, and I have a lot to say about that, and then also about who truly cares about the military men and women of our armed forces that are used as pawns in these illegal wars.
Well, there's one more. Oh, please.
I am nobody important. I am not running for office. I am not an intellectual scholar. My name is Ann Camerell. I work for the Agency for International Development overseas, and I was serving in Beirut in 1983. April 18, 1983. The American embassy was bombed at that time, and everyone seemed to know me. Well, they were telling you were to get out. And I said, what do you mean get out? Get out of the country. They were talking about Israel. Israel had invaded. They wanted Israel out. We were a very vulnerable site. And that was the first time the embassy was bombed. It wasn't just an ambassador. They're usually people who want to speak their mind about American policies and issues. I think Americans need to think very clearly of what's going on. There is right and there is wrong. And you expressed it beautifully in the wrong that was wrong.
Thank you. We all remember oh, yes, please, a question in the back. We're going to break it in 5 minutes so you can finish what's left of those donuts and have some coffee, and we'll be back in shape after 10 minutes.
One more question.
Good morning, my name is Mary Nesnick and I'm an unemployed Arabist. But I have a question about opinion molding, and since at least a decade, Iran has been in the religious Christian nationalist, Christian fundamentalist messaging on parallel universe television broadcasts from religious broadcasters about the eternal enemy. And this enemy imaging is now come to fruition. There's no regulation on that messaging, and yet there's a close correlation between the relationship of these broadcasters of Christian Zionism and the war we have now. What regulation is there? Is that important?
Would you ask the question again?
What breaks are there on this, or is there a regulation for this religious freedom expression, which is really messaging for another country?
It's a real problem, of course. I don't know what the breaks are. I know who's in charge. But I think the good news is that because of, well, let's face it, Americans don't like killing other people by starving them to death. Okay? I come from a tradition where my grandfathers were starved to death in Ireland. Okay? It's not a nice thing to come from. And not only that, of course, at least the Israelis themselves are admitting to what, 70,000 people, mostly non-combatants there. So all I'm saying here is that Americans are becoming informed. We've got a long way to go, but I understand that the president's approval ratings this morning was something like 58% and 59% were against the war in Iran. And, so I think the progress is just so slow, and I guess if there are no other questions, we'll break for a little while. So, okay, one more, please.
Tim Rush with the News Service. I just wanted to ask about the whole factor of the situation evolving toward use of nuclear weapons. On both sides, certainly we have the so-called Samson option, long known from the Israeli side. On the U.S. and British side, people may not be as aware of just how high level some of the insane people are who think that you can fight and win a nuclear war, that tactical nuclear weapons can be used safely. We have Thomas Buchanan, Admiral number 2 in our STRATCOM, in charge of all our nuclear weapons, a year and a half ago said, we don't want a nuclear war, but if we have to fight it, we have to fight it to win it. We have to have enough nuclear weapons left over at the end to dominate the world after nuclear war. We have a fellow in Britain named Malcolm Chalmers from the originally Royal Institute of Service Academies, now number 2 advisor to the Secretary of the Defense Secretary of Britain. He said a few years ago that he wanted to see a Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids using nuclear weapons to threaten Crimea. And then a year later, when he was actually appointed to the Defense Ministry of Britain, said, well, let's drop a demonstration nuclear weapon in a remote area of Russia to show that we are willing to go there. Now, when you have to get that level, intersecting these Christian Zionists and the really fanatic greater Israel types that think they're bringing on the second coming or whatever, we've got obviously very, very dangerous territory. How how can we raise this issue in a way that we got through, and how do you evaluate the possibility of a false flag attack that would be used to, another 9/11, for instance. One of the other independent candidates, not here, but very active on this, Diane Sayre, running for U.S. President as independent, has raised the question, are we potentially facing what you call an Epstein class, new 9/11 to justify our use of nuclear weapons?
Well, of course, 1967, the attack on the Liberty was basically a false flag operation. Not the first time, likely not the last.
I would share the great concern here. You know, I've been watching this stuff for 6 decades. Okay? Never before have I seen this so close to the possible use of nuclear weapons. Now, except for the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which, thank God, we had a sensible president who turned down the military and at great peril. Resisted and talked to Khrushchev, and later they both breathed real sighs of relief because they were able to satisfy their militaries. Kennedy saying, look, tell your guys we're going to pull those missiles out of Turkey, okay? Now, after that, 8 months after that, John Kennedy made a speech at American University. It was the 10th of June. I was 3 months a member of the CIA, right? And what he said, and that pertains to this, he says, look, we've been through a lot. We, Russia and the United States, have never been alone among all the major powers of the world. We've never been at war with each other, real war. We want the same things for our children, but the worst thing that would happen would be to have one nuclear power face the other with a choice between humiliating defeat and using nuclear weapons. Well, that held. That held until a couple of months. Now, my view is that the Iranians will have the upper hand because Israelis and U.S. are running out of weapons. Okay? Now, when Netanyahu is in extremis, people ask me, would he be tempted to use nuclear weapons? And I say, well, what kind of guy is he? Oh, you know, he does genocide, he does forced starvation, and I say, you tell me why he wouldn't. Okay? And so that's very concerning. Now, as was mentioned, Admiral, what's his name? The guy from CENTCOM. Buchanan, yeah, this is 2 years ago, we're going to win. So here I am, a Russian leader, which I try to put myself in the shoes of for 6 decades, and say, my God, these guys are crazy. That's the worst thing, okay? It's not only Netanyahu who's crazy, okay? I thought, and I wrote, and I warned everybody, don't worry about attacking Iran because they would close the Strait of Hormuz, and look, oh, wait a minute, it's all just bluster, says McGovern, okay? So I didn't know how crazy these guys are. And neither does Putin, and neither does Xi, okay? So thanks for injecting that note of caution here. That's where I come out on it. It doesn't mean it's religious, it doesn't mean it's dogma, but I've been around a while for what it's worth. Let's repair now for 5 minutes and get the next panel started. Thanks very much for all your attention, for your great questions. And let's hear it for Old Guard.